Boom. Alrighty. So welcome to this first episode in what's going to be a series on early analytic philosophy and putting early analytic philosophers in uh, conversation with some work that's being done by current thinkers. I'm really excited to have Scott Soames as the first guest to talk about a little bit what he talks about in his book, What is Meaning? Um, so Scott Soames is a professor at USC, studied at MIT, and is just a first-rate philosopher of language. And so, yeah, we're gonna jump into some questions about essentially just what the central question of early analytic philosophy was, which is about propositions, thoughts, content. What are they? How to make sense of them. So let's start with the first question. What is the role of thoughts or propositions in philosophical and semantic theory?
Well, you've already stated a bit of it, and they are the primary bearers of truth and falsity. They're the things we assert or deny or doubt or assume or believe or know. And crucially, they are also often thought to be, though not always, the meanings of sentences or their semantic contents. That is to say, declarative sentences. Um, they are also references of, they are also occur in clauses like the proposition that the earth is round. And as we say, he believes the proposition that the earth is round, or he believes that the earth is round. Um, so they can also be named. Um, Russell was somebody who tried to prove logicism. What is logicism? That's the view that arithmetic was reducible to logic. That's a proposition that states a relationship between arithmetic and logic, or Church's thesis. That's a name of a thesis that anything computable by any means will be computable by a Turing machine, a certain formal device for thinking about that. Um, and they can be the things we refer to when I say something and you say that's true or that's
Mhm.
false. So they're quite central. They play a lot of important roles. And they're the most difficult thing, basically, in the philosophy of language to get clear about.
Right, right. And so the centrality of the proposition, just for people who maybe aren't as familiar or just getting started in learning about analytic philosophy, would you say that the reason that it becomes so central in analytic philosophy and such a focus is because it's sort of thought of, at least initially, as the bearer of truth and falsity, and that the
Yes.
reason that, yeah, so the focus that comes to it is basically, there are things that we think are true, and very often we sort of look past those things. But to ask what the proposition is to ask what is the thing that is true? What is this object that we're predicating something, either truth or falsity, to?
Yeah,
Roughly,
exactly right. We,
right,
we, we naturally do look past that.
right, right. We sort of just think, okay, like,
It's the content of our thought at a
right,
given moment.
right. And I
And
mean,
what are we thinking about when we think of thought? We're thinking about the subject of the thought.
right, right,
We're
right,
not
right.
thinking of the thought.
Of the thought itself, the content, and just to draw this distinction in super simplistic ways, like if you somebody says like the cat is in the tree or something like that, like
Yes.
obviously you just think about the cat in the tree and you think about the cat being in the tree. You think about
Mhm.
the objects themselves and the relation that holds between them, but the and there's almost something kind of quasi transcendental going on here where all of a sudden we're looking back and thinking, but wait a minute, what is this thing? The cat is in the tree, which is the object that is of interest. And that's the first person in analytic philosophy to really bring us to this point, as far as I understand it, because this is also the sort of classic story, is Frege, correct?
Frege, I would say, was the first.
Okay.
He actually had people who he influenced on both sides of the analytic continental divide. Edmund Husserl was much
Right.
influenced by him. And Bertrand Russell
Right.
was much influenced by him. And even Wittgenstein in the Tractatus
Hmm.
was influenced by him.
And Frege, yeah, as you're saying, had a lot of broad influence, and his main concern, which is just again a point of interest for people who may not know, was and kind of informs a good amount of his philosophy is that he's thinking solely about mathematics. He was trying to
Yes,
create a philosophy of mathematics.
that's right.
So what he ends up saying about thoughts and propositions, it just to keep that in mind for people who are listening, because I think that maybe that's what we should move on next to is what do these early thinkers about propositions, Frege and Russell, what did they have to say about them? How do they conceive of them?
Okay, let's see. Well, I think I already said they took them to be the meanings of sentences, declarative sentences. And that raised a difficult question. What are the meanings of sentences? Well, the meanings of sentences are somehow combinations of or determined by the meanings of the parts of the sentences and the relationship that those parts in the sentence bear to one another.
Right.
So we have to identify what these individual meanings are, and we have to say something about how they get related in the proposition, which will be at least in part determined on how they're related in the sentence that the proposition that expresses that proposition.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so this like going back to the previous example of like the cat is in the tree, like, we're thinking that somehow the meaning of this whole sentence relates to the meanings of the words cat in the and tree in a similar way to how the sentence is built out of the words, right?
That was what both Frege and Russell started out thinking and tried to work out
Right.
in somewhat different ways.
Sure. And yeah, what are some of the subtleties of those accounts?
Well, let's see. Let's take the simplest one.
Hmm.
Start with Russell. Um, 1903. And what was it called? What was his book called? The Principles of Mathematics.
Ah, and there it is.
Uh, and yet he was going to use this as a structure that would give him concepts he needed for philosophy in every area. So his simplest example is Socrates is human. And so he said the proposition has two constituents, the man Socrates and the property being human. But you can't just write Socrates and then underneath it write being human and have that make sense.
Right.
Or you can't write being human Socrates. It can't be just some kind of list of the two meanings. Well, what else? What are we missing there? What are we after? We are after something that represents an individual in the world as being a certain way, and so will be true, just in case that individual is that way. So what we've got to do is know, in this case of Socrates and humanity, humanity is a property. Socrates is an individual. And what we have to do is, so to speak, apply that property to the individual or predicate that property of the individual.
Right.
And what are we doing when we do that? What we're doing is representing Socrates as being that way. Properties are ways things can be.
Hmm.
And we want to know how this notion of predication gets encoded or determined or represented in the proposition that Socrates was human.
Right.
And that notion of predication, what would you say it was? We've got an individual and we've got a way an individual can be. What are we doing?
Putting them together, right?
We're putting them together. We're
Right,
saying the individual is that way.
right, right,
That's the way the individual is. We'll call that the relation of predication.
right, right.
Okay. Um, Now, that's, I think, fairly clear. But what is the proposition? Remember, the proposition is the meaning of the sentence. It somehow contains these two elements, and they're related by predication. One of them is predicated of the other.
Right.
Now, predication is something we do. It's something
Right.
you just did.
Right. Right. Right.
It's
Right.
something we all do when we
Yes.
think about things.
Yep.
But propositions, they thought of, both Frege and Russell, both thought of them as abstract objects. They were some kind of combination
Yes.
of the meanings of the parts. And then something happened to relate the parts to one another so as to represent something as being some way.
Right. Right. And can I interject here really quick,
Yeah.
just to I think that this is a aspect of, I think the idea that the meanings of the sentences are built out of the meanings of the words, that's pretty intuitive. But one interesting part about both Frege and Russell, and I feel like the reason why I wanted to bring up that they're both trying to create a philosophy of mathematics is that when initially we were talking about thoughts, one might think that thoughts are going to have something to do, the story of how we talk about thoughts is going to have something to do with human brains. And,
Yes,
that's
of
how
course.
people colloquially think of thoughts. But that what you look back at and you see, well, that's actually not the case for Frege and Russell. They have this understanding that's very objective out there in the world, again, in this Platonic realm. And, if you read Frege's The Thought, that is sort of like
He calls it the thought,
he calls it the thought, but then he very sort of like
but it's
slyly
not your thinking.
right, because he makes this distinction between thoughts and ideas. And he says, listen, ideas are over here, thoughts are over here, never the twain shall meet, sort of a thing. And obviously it's more complicated than that. But that there's something sort of odd, I think, that anybody who is sort of just coming across this literature, again, if you didn't know that they were trying to eventually establish a philosophy of mathematics and they had this whole philosophical program, you'd sort of think this is odd and you'd sort of already know, like, there's a philosophical program going on here because it's just like, this is not how we normally would necessarily think of thoughts. Now, that's, not to say anything hugely against, Frege and Russell, because obviously these guys were geniuses, but the idea that you've just got these things out there in the world which are these individual sentence meanings, we got basically these parts, and then they also want to say that somehow out there they also come into these unities, and this is the problem that you're coming to, is basically what that they also came to, which is how do these parts come together to form a unity which represents the world as being a certain way? Because again, the whole reason that we're interested in these questions in the first place is the question of truth or falsity. These things need to bear truth or falsity. In order to be true or false, something has to represent something either being the way it is or the way it isn't, right? So, um, anyway, so that's all driving us to this
Just
point.
think of just think of what problem they face. Think of
Right,
any structure you want.
right,
And we can have a simple sentence, we can have a compound sentence. It can be a hierarchical structure, it could be a branching structure, and it could have
right,
linear order of the terminal nodes, which could be the words, but it
right.
could then have some kind of hierarchical organization of them above them. And you ask, what does this abstract thing, how does it represent the world? And you're thinking, well, look, we started with a sentence, which is an
Right,
abstract thing too. It's made up
right,
of a bunch of words related in a certain way. And the sentence by itself doesn't do anything.
right,
It doesn't represent anything.
right,
But how does this hierarchical structure that you've built out of what you call the meanings of the words which are now just standing in certain relations to one another, how does it do anything? How
Right.
does it represent anything?
Right. Well, here,
Isn't this just something else that has to be interpreted? But if it has to be interpreted, it can't be the meaning.
well, there's just I just wanted to pull up. I wonder if I can even show this. There's just a section in the
Oh,
book
that,
where
yeah.
where you just lay out all of these basically like here are all these ways that you could sort of visualize what's going on here.
Yeah.
But none of these things, represent. And basically, I just point that out because I think that so far I've sort of been speaking to people who maybe haven't studied much of analytic philosophy, but I think for people who have, for me, this question never even arose until I started reading it. And I was like, oh, right. Like, yeah, there is no underlying unity here. Like, why, like I've just totally accepted that. But obviously, read the book. It explains the sort of problem and articulates the problem well. But anyway, so here we have this problem of the unity of the proposition. And so Frege and Russell have this account that seems, again, very intuitive in one sense, where the meaning of the sentence being built out of the meaning of the words, but then there's this big problem in the middle of it. So then what in the history of analytic philosophy happens next? What was the sort of move that people made?
They were struggling, and they were struggling for a long time. The Tractatus, which is a very unusual book and
Yeah.
very idiosyncratic, Wittgenstein had a good idea at that point. He didn't want to posit Fregean propositions, and he didn't want to posit Russellian propositions. He
Hmm.
didn't want to posit complex meanings of sentences. He wanted to say that the parts have meaning and they're put together in a certain way. And what he was thinking of was that uses of sentences have
Hmm.
meaning. Not a pure abstract object, but a use of a sentence in conformity with the semantic conventions that govern it.
Right.
What is a use of a sentence? He didn't say what a use of a sentence, but
Right.
using a sentence is what speakers do.
Right.
They're the people who use the sentence in a certain way. They're the people who perform the acts of predication that lead to representation.
Hmm.
And that he said that about atomic sentences, but he wasn't really able to generalize that to the non-atomic sentences. And although he didn't put forward structured meanings like Frege and Russell, it was a gesture in the direction of it's something you do.
Sure. Absolutely.
And it wasn't picked up. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah.
It wasn't picked up by philosophers because I was going to say, I was like, let's not get too ahead of ourselves because then there's this whole phase in analytic philosophy where propositions, because of this problem of the unity and other things, but basically we start moving towards a view where the whole idea that, again, the intuitive part of the idea that these bearers of and the meanings of sentences are built out of the parts like the sentences are, the meanings of the words, that
Mhm.
kind of goes out the window.
That was
Um,
thought to be redundant, didn't do any
right,
work.
exactly. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Right. Thanks for saying what I was trying to say there. But yes, exactly. So what's this sort of school of thought? Can we talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. I mean, it's a school of thought that I think was pioneered initially by Carnap in the early 40s and then by
Mm,
Davidson in the late 50s and mid 60s. It's the idea of a truth conditional conception
sure.
of me. So the idea was that to understand a language and hence to understand all the different parts of the language and sentences of the language is to be able to understand the conditions under which uses of the individual sentences would be true.
Right. Uh,
Um, And so we got first a kind of a mini version in Carnap, but then Davidson Truth and Meaning in the mid 1960s um, championed that view. What you need to know to understand a given language, if you don't understand it, is to be given a theory which derives a certain biconditional, stating the truth conditions for each declarative sentence of the language. The sentence "snow is white" is true in language so-and-so, if and only if snow is white.
Right. Right.
And you do that for every sentence of the language. We don't talk about propositions here, but that's all there is to understanding a language.
Okay, so now how initially understood this sort of move was that, again, even back in the days of the proposition, we were saying that the reason that we're interested in these things is that they're the bearers of truth and falsity. They represent the world as being a certain way. And so
Mhm.
then even with under that paradigm, there was a sense in which the meaning of a sentence sets conditions on the world, basically as it because it represents the world as being a certain way. Then the question is, okay, what is that way that it represents the world as being? And then basically people just dashed away the idea that there are propositions there and they just went straight for, okay, what are these conditions that the world must satisfy? That's what we really mean when we're talking about meaning. Now, that's how I understood the whole truth conditional thing, was that, again, it was just a development out of the tradition that is interested in propositions. But I don't think I understood Davidson's theory quite, because when I was looking at the notes that you sent over for this conversation, the 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 theories that Davidson is talking about, these biconditionals, you said it's only a material biconditional.
That's
It's
right.
that is, I was when I read that, I was like, okay, I'm not even going to try to figure this out before we have the call. I'm just going to
Okay,
ask
well,
this.
tell me why it worries you.
Well, so because a normal sort of possible worlds theory, quote unquote, basically says that these conditions, the truth conditions, are the necessary conditions that a world would have to display in order for this to be true.
True.
And the necessary and sufficient conditions.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's a notion of what people might have once called logical equivalence or just strict equivalence, right? Across
Yeah.
possible worlds. That makes
Yes.
sense to me. Again, there is an issue that you've pointed out with that theory, and I understood that issue pretty early on once I was reading it, and I was like, okay, yes, this makes sense. So basically, what the issue with the sort of like initial issue with removing that necessity and making it that it's just a extensional or material equivalence is that, for example, a material equivalence could be made between any two
True
true
sentences or
sentences.
falsehood.
Exactly. So basically, I mean, because yeah, it's the problem. Well, we'll get to it, but the problem with the possible worlds theory is that it doesn't cut things fine grained enough. But
Yeah.
then it turns out that the problem with the material conditional is that it seems, at least prima facie, obviously to not cut things fine grained enough, because it only
Sure.
cuts things in a binary, true or false. And obviously, there's more than two meanings that we have. So how could there
Mhm.
be, like, we don't ever just mean only the true or the false or whatever. So I was blown away by that. So what exactly, and we don't need to get caught up on Davidson, but is there anything you can say at least initially to make it more plausible than that?
I hope. I was never convinced of that
Yeah.
either, but it was a very popular paradigm that was
So
pursued
bizarre.
for about 20 or 25 years.
Yeah. And continues to be. Continues to be, yes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I've kind of lost a bit. Um, and the idea is, David said, well, there are constraints on how I'm going to prove the theorems.
Yes. Okay.
That this has to be a theory which generates truth conditional biconditionals for each sentence of the language on the basis of the composition of the sentences. In
Okay.
other words, on the basis of its parts.
I
So
see.
think of what you do just suppose you're doing such a theory, which we do for first order logic.
Right, right,
So there'd be a clause for singular terms.
right,
It's going to say this singular term refers to something if and only if it's so and so,
right,
and so on. There's going to be a clause for predicates.
right.
It's going to say it applies to an object if and only if the object is so and so.
Hmm.
Then we're going to have the parts for the truth conditional conjectives, and we're going to have the quantifiers, which have higher order properties of
Right.
lower properties. And we just state those in the normal way. And then we compositionally derive T sentences. S is true in L if and only if P, where P is what you get by applying the relevant rules to the parts of this sentence, and you get the outcome. You get in.
Yep.
You never get snow is white if and only if the earth is round.
Right. Even though,
Because
again, prima facie, those are extensionally equivalent.
yes.
Right, right,
And Davidson knew that perfectly well.
right, of
He
course.
thought that if you impose enough constraints on how you derive the T sentences, you're going to end up with things on the right-hand side. S is true in
Hmm.
L if and only if blah, which are as close to paraphrase as it makes sense to get.
Sure, sure. I,
That's what he thought, and that's what he tried to convince people of.
right, right. Okay. Well, we won't pursue that too far. But at the same time, I think that, I want to underscore that that is basically just how radical of a position that is. And I did not realize how radical a position it was when I first read through your book. And because I just kept reading the if and only if in, again, this like possible worlds necessary way, strict implication. And I was like, wait, what is happening here? So I'll have to look more into that, but we're going to move on just because we want to talk about your view, not Davidson's. But so when we do talk about this strict implication view, what was the issue there? Just really briefly. I talked about this
Yeah, we're
more.
talking about possible world semantics, and
Yes. Yep.
and it's going to give you biconditionals as well.
Yep.
It's going to say S is true in W
Hmm.
if and only if in W P.
Yes.
Okay. Now, how do you think we should understand in W?
I guess my understanding would be that W satisfies a certain condition if and only if W basically displays a certain property, which is a state of affairs, I guess, or something like that. Or maybe in W is sort of like a
Okay, so
containment of state of
W's
affairs.
are possible world states, yes?
Right. Yes. Yep.
Okay. And so possible world states, merely possible world states, are not states the world is in,
Right.
but they're states the world could have been in.
Yep.
Okay. So when we say such and such is true in W, what we're saying is that if W were the actual state,
Sure. Okay. Yep.
then such and such would be true.
Okay. Yep. Absolutely.
Now let's get to understanding the theorems. S is true in W if and only if in W P.
Right.
What am I checking the truth of in W when I say S is true in W? Am I saying the sentence is
Mm.
true in W, namely, if W were the state the world were in, this very sentence S would be
Okay.
true.
Sure. Right.
We're not saying that.
You're not saying that. Right. Right. Right, because for example, basically, if Aristotle had never gone into philosophy, and also English had never been invented as a language,
Yeah.
then the sentence, Aristotle never went into philosophy wouldn't be true in that world, right? That sentence wouldn't be. But
But something else would.
something else would. Right, right,
What is the
absolutely.
something else?
What is this something else? And this is, well, okay, right. And so that something else is presumably, obviously, on your view, the proposition. But then there's this sort of like, I guess I'm wondering the issue about the fine-grainedness of the sort of a possible world's view. Are you getting to that with this, or is this a
I'm
separate
not,
issue?
we will get to that with
Okay,
this,
yes,
but
absolutely. All
this
right.
this is something that
This is okay, okay.
even more basic than
Yes.
it.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it.
Okay.
Interesting.
So we've got, instead of extracting propositions from theorems of possible world semantics, propositions expressed by sentences,
Yeah.
we can't make sense of the theorems unless
Right.
we already have notions of propositions.
I see. Right. Some sort of thing that is the content that that sentence would pick out or does pick out. But yeah, okay, I see. I see. I see. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
it would be true.
Yep.
And why would it be true? Because it represents things in a certain way.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
And if
Absolutely.
W were actual,
Right.
things would be that way.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Got
So
it.
if you think you've already got propositions, possible world semantics in the sense, I mean, the theorems
Right.
make individual sense.
Right.
Uh, but if you don't, if you think, no, I'm starting just from language and rules of language and so
Mm-hmm.
on, it's
I
very hard
see.
to make sense
Mm.
of what's going on.
That's actually a that I wasn't even thinking about that issue. So that's yeah, that is a much more basic issue with it of the even interpretation of that. Okay, okay, sure. Well, I would like to talk more about the possible world theories, but just because we're a little bit more limited on time, let's just go to your theory, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about possible worlds more. But yeah, so what is the theory of propositions that you end up defending and what is meaning? Or that you defend now, if you've changed some of your views since then.
Well, I changed bits and pieces. Um, the theory, it's an act-based theory of propositions. And they are acts which represent things as being in certain way, and hence are true if and only if the things are that way.
Right.
And what are the acts? Well, the acts start out with very simple things like predicating properties of objects, that we can then have acts of applying certain sort of operators to already existing propositions, like for the truth functions and for necessary operators. Then there's belief, which is just a two-place predicate
Right.
relating an agent to a proposition. And
Sure.
propositions are the kinds of things that I've mentioned. Um, and one of the things that this really does is it gives you a way of bringing together a lot of related different concepts. Um, let's ask ourselves. I'm not in any way getting away from possible world states, but
Right.
what are they? Um, what are world states? Um, and I'm thinking that there are certain ways that the world can be. And what are these ways? Well, what do we really think? We think, suppose we're doing some inquiry. Suppose the inquiry is, I don't know, who will win the World Series this year of all
Sure.
the different teams. And so then we will generate some world stories about
Yeah.
all the various teams. And so we now, each one of those is a complete world story. Okay. And so we'll be considering the possible worlds in which one is the possible worlds in which that's the true story.
Right.
What are we constructing these stories from? Propositions.
Hmm.
We have to have the propositions first
Sure.
to
Sure.
construct the world stories.
Right.
Then we get worlds. Then how do we get truth? Well, the proposition is true just in case it represents the world as being this way, and it is this way.
Right. Right. If it represents the actual world state.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And
Absolutely.
so we can make sense of all these notions that are used as if they made sense on their own.
Right. Right. So that's interesting. So do you subscribe to the idea that possible worlds are built out of propositions, or is that not quite what you're saying?
First of all, I think there's only one world. Um,
I'm with you
and
there.
but I think there are different ways the world could be or could have been.
Sure.
And those are properties that the world doesn't have,
Yes.
but it could have had. Just as
Okay,
I have
yes.
properties, there are properties I don't have, but I could have had.
Yeah.
And it's just a story at that level.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of idea, but we just do it at a higher level.
Hmm.
So we have all these things first, then we can construct world states, and then we can make sense of modal talk.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely.
That doesn't mean possible world semantics is going to be fine-grained enough. It's not going to be
Right.
fine-grained enough. But what it does say is, okay, just don't define the proposition expressed by a sentence as the set of possible world states at which it comes out true.
Right. 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 Absolutely. We're
So
still
we
sort of.
still have all the logical apparatus.
Hmm.
We just don't make claims that that logical apparatus can't support.
Sure. Sure.
And another aspect of my view is it's not just a matter of metaphysical possibility. It's much more fine-grained than that.
Mm.
In fact, just a very few assumptions need to be satisfied in order to show that meanings of sentences are not sets of circumstances of any fine-grainedness.
Sure. Sure.
And
And
what
that.
are they? They're the things that I've been using all along. There are propositions. What are those? Those are acts of predicating properties and relations of various things.
Right.
Those are
So.
things that people do, acts people perform.
Right, right. And so this is just to sort of paint a broad picture for the audience. So we start with Russell and Frege, who have sentence meanings being built out of the parts, and then they have the problem of how do these parts come together.
Yes.
Wittgenstein sort of has a moment of insight about, this idea that there are acts that are somehow involved with this. That doesn't get taken up. And then we go into the Davidson, Carnap, Lewis whole tradition, and that
Yes.
then the idea that the meanings of sentences are built out of these parts disappears. It's just possible world states. And you're going all the way back and saying, okay, we need to still build things out of these parts, but we need to answer this question of the unity of the proposition. And that way that we're going to answer it is taking a little bit of this Wittgensteinian line, and we're going to think that what we do as agents and we take part in this is that we build these propositions essentially out of these parts, and we represent the world as being in a certain way. And these act types, again, you're not saying that somehow literally the action in my brain is true or false, but it's the type of action that's going on that is true or false. Yes,
Um,
essentially.
let me think.
Yeah,
The acts represent in a real way,
yes,
and hence can represent truly or falsely in a real way, in a certain derivative sense.
sure. Yeah,
They are acts that we perform and the performance of those very acts, as opposed to others,
Yes.
means that we're representing things in a certain way.
Yeah.
And we can say there's a derivative sense in which the acts have those properties.
Sure. Have true or false as their property.
Yes.
Right. As opposed to just the type of action, but the sense in which the type of action is true or false is also to say
It's
that,
that if we perform it, we're going to be representing, and it may be truly or falsely representing.
right, right. And to have it be
Think of
not
think of think of an act that sometimes we call acts irresponsible.
sure.
It doesn't mean that the
Right,
act is not living up to its responsibilities. It
right.
means that the person who's performed the act is
Hmm.
not living up to his responsibility. It's the same move.
Interesting. Okay, sure. Absolutely. But at the same time, with an irresponsible action, theoretically, you and I could do the same irresponsible action. So it's not as if each person has their
No,
own set
of
of
course.
propositions. Right, exactly.
No, no.
Yeah, yep, yep. Right. So that's the kind of, that saves that whole potential line of objection. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Um, well, there were a couple questions I wanted to ask just about your theory itself. Let's see. Okay. So yes, propositions, are they necessarily existent on this view? We can just kind of run through these.
No, I don't think
No.
they're necessarily existent, but I don't
Yep.
think there's any reason that they have to be.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. And that makes sense given that they're actions of agents.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so this is an interesting in the beginning of the book, you sort of say that I could probably just find it and read it, but it's basically you essentially say that um the paradigm of representation isn't just linguistic representation, but really you say you start with perception basically. And you say when you
Yes.
see an object as red, then you are thereby predicating redness to the object. So basically, that these act types can happen in a way that isn't necessarily with language as the paradigm. I'm
I hope
interested.
so. Yes, I think
Yeah,
that's crucial.
right. But I think that that's a part that, again, many analytic philosophers might be like, whoa, like, whoa, you can't do that. So it's interesting. It's interesting to me that you say that. And I guess the
Think about
question,
visualizing, not just seeing. Think about
right,
visualizing. Think about imagining.
right, right,
And
right,
we can imagine things as being certain ways. And so well, we are just thinking of them as if they were that way,
right, without necessarily having a
thinking
sentence.
they are that way.
Right. Or without thinking they are that way. And so, um, and because I think I'm not sure if it was in the book or if it was elsewhere, but you also were saying something that like essentially we also want to be able to make sense of like non-human animal cognition and the
Oh,
possibility
yes.
that they represent things as
That's
well.
obvious.
Right.
I mean,
Well, this
there would
this
be
is
no
where
animals otherwise.
right, exactly. Right. And this is where it's like, well, they've got to be representing things and thinking of things as either true or false, or else it's like there's a predator behind me. It's not gonna be,
Yeah, are
like
they looking at in their mind's eye at a Platonic proposition?
no. Yeah, right. But they're representing things. And so
Yes.
that I think is an important aspect of this because and it sort of like points people in maybe the right direction of what your view is and how it might differ from what the traditional views were. But I think that I was asking basically if it is possible to represent things in a way. Basically, could somebody, obviously, if non-human animals can represent things, then you don't need language to represent
Right.
things. You don't need spoken language. And I think that, I said something in the questions about the private language argument, which don't even fully understand. So like, I've just never really gone down the late Wittgenstein route. So it might be totally irrelevant. But I think that I was wondering is that, are there any concerns in the philosophical tradition that basically the idea that we could represent things without language is somehow, you know, problematic or erroneous or something like that, like that you are aware of, or is it just sort of like even if there are, that's nonsense because obviously animals can
Well,
represent.
we have to be able to represent, animals have to be able to represent. And it doesn't mean that what we're my my cognition of a proposition may be internal, but you can cognize the same proposition that I
Right.
do, at least in principle.
Right. Right.
Um, and so it's not private in the sense that people thought sense data were private, and Wittgenstein had no patience with that.
Right. Right.
Uh, as so, I don't think that there's any real threat there. I do think I didn't go into this in the book, that there are limitations. What's it like to be a bat? You know that paper?
Oh, absolutely. Yep, for sure.
What do you think the problem? What's the issue there?
I mean, there's a million issues there that's raised, but I think that um, you know, I think really what that problem is that it's the issue of like first person experience, not just necessarily phenomenal consciousness, but literally just the problem of that we'll never be able to reduce the first person to the third person is essentially is where I get
Well,
it.
I think we can't, yeah, do that. Um, but can we understand?
Hmm.
Is it possible for us to understand the cognition of bats?
Right. Right. Right.
And it may be, this is what I think. I think studying them enough, we will know
Hmm.
basically what they're able to perceptually represent
Sure.
as being which ways.
I see.
Be
Okay.
able to see this thing can be that
Hmm.
way, that thing can
Right.
be another way.
Right. Right.
They do
Nice.
it by cognitive means.
Right.
It is not within our purview. We don't have those cognitive means of representing those things as being that way.
Sure.
We have to use other cognitive means and indirectly try to infer from the behavior of bats and from what we know about their brains and their perceptual systems, what they're representing to be what way. And that means that the cognitive aspects of their propositions, which are cognitive acts,
Right.
are different from ours.
Whoa. 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 Okay.
But
Sure.
their representational contents of those cognitive acts can, in certain cases, be the same.
Be the same. So in some sense, we could entertain this, or again, entertain the same proposition that a bat could. Is sort of the idea.
We have two kinds of propositions. One, which places one kind of proposition is just this is represented in this way. I don't
Right.
care how you got to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we also have propositions which represent things in that way, but only by via carrying with it this cognitive sequence.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
we can get the basic part about them, even though we can't cognize it in the way that.
Interesting. Okay. Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And is that cognitive sequence that you're talking about? Is that sort of like the causal theory of reference that we're talking
No,
about, or is
it's
that
not the causal
it's
theory
not
of
that? Okay.
reference.
Got it. Got it.
No.
Got it. Got it. All right. I wasn't sure because I
Um,
do want to talk about that at some point. But all right. All right. So that's a separate thing. That's a separate
but
thing.
look, what am I saying here? Propositions are not this sort of fringe subject in the philosophy of logic or semantic. It's very central to understanding a lot of what we need to understand.
Yeah.
And it's challenging because we are certain beings with certain cognitive apparatus,
Right.
and we're going to have a natural way of thinking about things which differs from other beings.
Sure.
But we need to have a framework which is rich enough to be able to encompass that. We can't just be representing things in this way. It's representing it. How we achieve that is important. Then we'll be able to know the similarities between us and things like bats and the differences.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow, interesting. Okay, and yeah, you didn't talk about that in the book, but that is
No.
super interesting. Yeah, that's got to be some stuff that's coming down the pipe, I'm sure. Um, well, I think I do want to talk a little bit about sort of just your sort of broader, maybe like metaphilosophical position in semantics and stuff, because I mean, obviously, you are considered like a defender of basically like what Kripke started broadly, and
Yes.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. Do you identify with that? What exactly? What can you say to that?
About Kripke, what did Kripke do?
Well, right. Kripke basically, I mean, the main thing that Kripke did, it seems like, is broke this idea that there's sort of like a veil of concepts in a sense, or just the conceptual theory of necessity, right? And of meaning.
Yeah. Um, he initially, the first thing he did, and he did this actually when he was still in high school, but he didn't publish it until after he became, I think it was the last year he was an undergraduate at Harvard. And this was the semantics for modal logic
Sure.
and you can just think of the propositional calculus, modal semantics for that. And he has a conception, there's a primitive for him.
Hmm.
Um, what could have been, but isn't. And in fact, he allows that that can even be relativized to um, that can be iterated. In other words, there's not just one set of possibilities, that there's a set of ways things could have been. And then there's a set of ways things could have been if they had been that way. And
Okay.
those
Right. Right.
those collapse. I mean, in S5, we say they collapse.
Yes. Yep.
But there's nothing in the Kripke semantics that makes them collapse.
Hmm.
And there are things that if you take this Kripke semantic seriously, is going to lead you to say they don't collapse. S5 is
Interesting.
far too strong.
Okay, got it.
Um, and if we're talking about a modal, then there's another thing. What do we want from a modal logic? Do we want the logic of necessity and possibility, where I'm emphasizing logic, that is, that which stems from the very nature of these notions?
Right.
Or do we want something broader, a theory of modal reality?
Hmm.
These aren't the same things. You're going to have a
Right.
richer modal system for the second than you have for the first. And all Kripke really gave us was the basis of that system, and it's a complete system and all that, but it's weaker than S4 and S5.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and so I think just giving us that system and showing us why, and not overrating it and taking it too far, is probably his first and most important contribution.
Interesting. Interesting. So you think of that before naming a necessity. You're like
Yes.
that was okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. Right. Because I was jumping straight to naming as sort of his big thing.
Well,
But
naming is, of course, a big thing, and I
right.
think it's essentially right about naming.
Okay.
And why do I think he's right? I think he's right because what you want from a theory of meaning, what is the semantic content of a name? Um, what you want is something that is, I call the minimum common denominator.
Hmm.
We can talk about various people, perhaps, that both of us know. You know him, a person by one name, I know him by that name too. Your associations with the name are very different from my associations with the name,
Ah, sure.
but we're still talking about the same person,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay? And what you want from a theory of meaning of the name is the least common denominator for all those people who are using that name to talk about the same thing.
Right.
And that's going to be the referent.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that it could only be the referent. Right.
That's right. And that's a way of putting the basic idea without going through the various arguments and saying why it's not really this and not really that. And I think he saw that right away.
Yeah.
Um, and it just seemed obvious to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and then we get the necessary up, and we get something similar, I think, for natural kind common nouns like water and gold and heat and
Right.
things of that kind. So their names too. And now we're going to get interesting examples of the necessary a posteriori. Um, and those, I think, were very surprising to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Shocking to me, at least. When I first read about them, I was like, what? I just spent this whole time reading Kant or whatever and like learning about how these categories fall. And then, yeah, it just got completely blown open. But now, the way that you've treated those issues, like, well, first of all, we could talk about it in the context of your conception of propositions. But as I understand it, you've got sort of like a more subtle reading of Kripke on the a posteriori or the necessary a posteriori, where
Well,
names.
tell me about it.
Well, okay, so as I understand it, names essentially you look at the examples that Kripke gave, and you basically say yes, there are necessary a posteriori propositions, but the names here don't actually play the crucial role in the examples that Kripke is giving. And in fact, in some cases, you think that the names actually make it so that the examples don't work. Like and this is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you think that Hesperus equals phosphorus actually is a priori. Is that correct?
I think there's more than one proposition
Okay.
that Hesperus is phosphorus. Um, and the semantic content of the two names,
Yes.
I think, is the same.
Yeah.
So then that semantic content is a priori.
I see. Right. Yep. Absolutely. The proposition is a priori.
But more is often understood by an utterance of Hesperus is phosphorus than merely the semantic content.
Yes.
Why? Let me ask you a question, which I found that I had a hard time remembering until I committed it to memory. What's Hesperus and what's phosphorus? What's the difference between them?
Hesperus is the name for, I actually don't know, but I'm going to say the morning star, and phosphorus is the name for the evening star. Is that correct?
Opposite.
Opposite. All right, but yes, you get the point. Right. Okay.
Right. I had to learn that.
Yes.
And I think that it is, you can say it's part of its meaning.
Sure.
I think I think it's something that is presupposed when somebody uses those terms, not Venus or
Yes.
anything like that, not the morning star, not the evening star, when they use those terms to an audience, they are presupposing that the audience will realize that Hesperus is conventionally
Yeah.
used to talk about something seen in the evening, and phosphorus is conventionally used for the morning.
Right.
Okay. Now, so if I assertively utter Hesperus is phosphorus, you will be perfectly happy, and I'm presuming you understand him, because I wouldn't use it if I didn't, and you realize that.
Right.
you can report me as saying, Soames said that Hesperus, which is seen in the evening, is phosphorus, which is seen in the morning.
Right.
Now, but you're not going to add a necessity operator
Right.
in the
Right.
front of that. Why? Because the inference you made was in terms of what you took me to be presupposing
Right.
and taking for granted. And I certainly was not taking for granted that this would be true at every world state.
Yep. Yep. Right. Right.
So that's what's going on in that sort of case.
So
So
now,
very often
yeah.
you use a name and it conveys more than just its referent.
Right. Right. But at this, and so you're sort of pulling apart this idea of the semantic content,
Yes.
which is necessary and a priori. And then there's also this other, Hesperus is equal to, I mean, sorry, the morning star is equal to the evening star. And
Mhm.
that is not necessarily part of the semantic content, but it's something that's
That's
being
right.
presupposed.
I
And
think that, yes.
that is a
Yes.
posteriori and contingent. Now, right there, it seems like you're pulling apart the a posteriori and the necessary in a way that elsewhere you argue is not the right approach because you're against 2D semantics. So I'm wondering where is the necessary a posteriori for you? Where does that land, or where does that arise?
Well, let's just stay with Hesperus as phosphorus.
Perfect.
Um, the there is a proposition which I call simply a bare proposition expressed by Hesperus as phosphorus, which is the same as Venus is Venus.
Hmm.
That's not an example of the necessary a posteriori.
Sure.
But there is a proposition which has that same representational content, but the cognitive content
Mm.
includes the designator that you used or the designators that you used.
Okay. Okay. Got
Okay.
it.
And sometimes that's not semantic content, but sometimes that gets communicated when you're speaking with others,
Sure.
particularly when you take those to be common associations of people who have heard those two names.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's still a necessary truth, but those that are enriched by these cognitions are a posteriori because
Mm.
you only know what they refer
Sure.
to a posteriori.
Sure. Okay. But so the am I understanding you right if I say that any semantic content that is necessarily true is a priori? Semantic content. Is that going to be right on your view? Because it's a
Um,
big claim, but I guess maybe just in this particular example, the semantic content is both a priori and necessary.
yes, in this
Okay.
context, but
Okay.
not in others.
Not in others. Okay, so there can be other situations in which one and the same semantic content will be both a posteriori and necessary.
I am a human being. I have a body made up of molecules.
Right. Okay, got it. Yes. Yes, I saw this in the notes. Right. Okay. Okay, got it. Got it. Got it. Yep. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, and we could go down the 2D route, but let's real quick. I do want to ask you just about basically your interest in the philosophy of language and where it comes from. I asked in the notes whether or not there was like a worldview that ties you in this area, sort of together. I know that you've said that you're a naturalist in the book, or at least you're out for a naturalistic theory of linguistic meaning. But yeah, what's driving your interest in the subject?
I don't think I know the answer to that question.
Okay, no
I
fair.
I have I was initially interested in it, and I worked on various aspects of it for a long time, and I'm still interested in those things. And I have a general view of at least a great deal of philosophy. I
Okay.
think that the borderline between philosophy and other disciplines is fluid and porous. And one of the great things in Western philosophy that is not true in every other approach to philosophy is that it has made enormous contributions to the individual disciplines.
Sure.
And this continues to happen. I think it will continue to happen even in our advanced disciplines, but it especially happens at the early stages
Yeah.
of our disciplines. And I think we are continuing to struggle to come up with a scientific understanding of language. I think we've made enormous progress. I think we have a long ways to go. And I think that makes this an area of inquiry which is ripe for philosophy. Now, philosophy tends to specialize in just these kinds of cases.
Sure.
Uh, and so that's why, I've often been in touch with and worked with linguists. I went to MIT and
Right.
those people, that sort of thing.
Right.
Uh, and I think it's simply going to continue, and I think we have at least 100 years more before
Fair enough.
before we understand languages as well as we'd like to.
Yeah, okay. And I'm actually interested when you were going to MIT, did you start with an interest in linguistics or did you start with an interest in philosophy and then just find yourself amongst the linguists as well?
I started with an interest in philosophy. I had, in my final year as an undergraduate at Stanford, I had a philosophy of language class by somebody who was much influenced by Chomsky.
Got it.
Then in the spring of my senior year, um, David Kaplan and Barbara Hall-Partee, the linguist, made a trip once a week up to Stanford to teach two graduate courses, one each. And I was allowed to take those courses. And so I became interested in what both of them had to say. And I thought, and that it wasn't exactly an accident that they came together. They had things to say about each other, and each attended the other's session as well.
Sure.
So I think that's what got me started. And then at MIT, I studied with linguists as well as with philosophers.
Sure. Okay.
And so
And
I just think
yeah,
it's a very exciting enterprise. I think we've made a lot of progress. I think we've got a lot of progress to go. I think in the area of semantics, the current linguists give far too much weight to just standard possible world
sure.
approaches, and I think we need to help wean them away from that. Uh, so I think there's a lot left to do.
And one thing that you also mentioned was working in the philosophy of law. I didn't realize that that was something that you do. Did you publish pretty regularly in philosophy of law?
I do now.
Wow.
For a long time, I didn't,
Okay, but you were
but
interested.
at some stage around 2010, I think it occurred to me that that was a natural thing to do. So I started
Hmm.
writing a few things, and I got invited to one particular law conference. And then the people at Georgetown said we put on a summer workshop at the end of May every year. Why don't you come and interact and speak with us and do things? And so I did that. And so I've met and interacted with, and I'm still in touch with and still publish uh, a variety of things about uh, interpretation, particularly legal interpretation.
Interesting. Interesting. Makes sense. Is there a lot of crossover with your philosophy of language work, would you say?
Yes.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah, particularly on the notion of what's the relationship between semantic content and speech acts assertion in particular.
Okay. Got it.
Because when you're looking at a text and especially a plural text produced by a Congress or a legislature or something like that. And there's a set of words that finally get agreed upon after all the speeches and arguments and modifications and so on. And then there's a question, what was asserted? Where do you look?
Hmm.
Where do you look to find out? Do you try to poll the individual legislators? Well, that's not going to work because they're not going to be available
Right, right, right,
and they're
right.
not
Oh,
really going to know.
wow. Interesting.
Ah, no,
Right.
I don't think that's what assertion is either. I think assertion is a kind of construct that you take all the publicly available evidence to a potential audience
Hmm.
and you say, what is the most reasonable interpretation of what they were doing when they
Whoa.
voted this in? And that's the content of the legislation.
And so, do you think that there is a fact of the matter about the content of the legislation? And I guess you do, based
Yes,
upon
there
that.
is a fact. There's generally a fact of the matter, but is there a fact of every matter? No.
Interesting. Sure, sure, absolutely.
But
Interesting.
then what do you do when there's a crucial fact that you need to go one way or the other in applying the case to an individual situation?
Right.
What do you do if this is one of the places where it was unsettled?
Sure.
Now, there's other things that happen. People, when they supported this, they gave speeches about it. They
Yep.
said things. They said
Right.
this is what they were aiming at.
Yep.
And previous judges may have looked at things and said, well, this is what we need from this. So you try to construct a rationale for the asserted content
Yep.
that in some cases is strong enough to lead you to a decision, even when the asserted content is silent about that.
Sure. Sure. You can kind of figure out what this content may have been just based on the determinations of these speeches and decisions, etc.
What were they trying to achieve?
Right, exactly, exactly. What would it make sense for this? Okay, okay, that's interesting. And is it? I assume that the interpretation is basically time sensitive, so to speak, of like when they were making this assertion. It's
Oh, of
based
course.
on that. Okay, got it. Absolutely, absolutely.
On the other hand, if you're adopting a constitution, you realize your audience is in the future as well. So
Wow.
you
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Right.
so you tailor some of your remarks. If you're an intelligent legislator, you'll tailor some of your remarks to that.
Yep, absolutely. There's some recognition that this is going to be interpreted by
Mhm.
people down the line. Wow. Well, that's super interesting. I'll have to look out for some of the stuff that you've written on that because I mean it does make sense. I think the one thing I was thinking about was, obviously, we're talking about representing the world as being a certain way and all that stuff in semantics. And then in law, obviously, like the first thing that comes to mind for me is, normative, and all of
Oh,
a
it's
sudden I'm like,
right. That's
right,
absolutely true.
so then it's like, whoa, we're going from the is to ought, and I was sort of like that is, but at the same time I can totally see the connection between the two, and obviously there are a lot of is claims that are being making based upon the
Based on,
potential
yeah.
ought. Right, absolutely. But wow, very interesting. Okay, is there a book out that I should be
I'll
looking
send
for?
you something.
Okay, got it. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, I kind of came to the end of our questions. I would be interested in maybe asking you just a couple of the ones from previously because it doesn't look like we've quite run out of time.
All
Um,
right.
you still well, one of the questions that I was going to ask is basically, yeah. So we've got this view where we're taking the pieces of and the meanings of words, putting them together as act types. And one of the pieces of a proposition, as you said, like Socrates is human. One of
Mhm.
these is a property. And so what is a property on your view, or a function for that matter?
Well, I don't have anything interesting to say.
Fair enough.
There are ways things could be.
Okay.
I don't know
Wait,
what else to say.
sure, sure. But basically, I guess one question would be, I mean, these are abstract objects. These are things
Yeah,
that exist out there in abstract space, so to speak. Um, and we do things with them.
we do things with them. Yes.
Okay. I think that that's really what I'm just looking to ask is whether or not there's some sort of, do we have some sort of mental symbol that, we use that and then somehow that's connected in the right ways or
Well, I don't see what work that's going to do because that'll
yeah,
just be another thing to interpret.
right.
Um, but I think animals do too.
Yep,
So
right.
it's
But
got
you're
to be it's got to be something we're capable of thinking of. What thinking of it means, I I don't know what to say.
well that's yeah,
What
nobody's
happens? Let me tell you, this is
yeah,
something colors. If I stare at a light bulb intently for a while and then turn away and close my eyes, I have a certain pattern of visual sensations, which
sure.
always leave. And there are certain colors, certain shapes that gradually change into something else and then go away. I'm aware of ways things can be even then.
Yeah, sure.
So the image, I guess, is an image. We might talk as if there's an image.
Right,
That's probably not an abstract object.
right.
Um, and I'm not sure what we think about abstract objects as opposed to they're not located in a single place.
Right, right.
But in terms of a positive story about them, I'm afraid I don't have much to say.
I think that's fair enough. It's an old problem, obviously. So
Mhm.
fair enough to leave it at that. Let's see if there's any of these other ones that I wanted to ask. Um, you know, let's just wrap it there. That was
All right.
awesome. All right, let me real quick bring the and this
So where
yes.
is this going to be? Or
So I'm gonna post this. I'll post this on YouTube and I'll send it to you once it's done. I'll probably re-record like a beginning to it a little bit and sort of have just to introduce you and introduce your work a little bit. So I might cut some of the stuff from the beginning that I said.
Mhm.
And then yeah, I'll just post it as is, and it'll be part of a series of videos that I'm gonna do. Um, I've got the other one lined up, or the second one lined up, and I'm hoping to do four or five basically. I'm gonna start here with just like very broad question about the proposition in general. And then the next one I'm doing is I'm talking about Wittgenstein specifically in the Tractatus. And then it'll be ideally talking about Quine and two dogmas of empiricism. And then eventually, or actually Carnap before that with the Afbau, and then talking about Quine. So yeah, I'm excited. Thank you so much for doing this, by the way. It's really good. I mean, and I have to tell you, like, this book is great. I love this book. It seriously did change a lot for me reading in philosophy. So I happened to come across it at a just half price bookstore down from where I worked, and some philosophy professor was getting rid of a lot of his books, Tom Sullivan, and I've gotten tons of books from this guy, but I was like, I'd heard of your name from like Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and stuff, but it's great. It's really great. So
Now,
thank you.
are you still in school?
I'm not. No, I studied philosophy at a place called St. Olaf College in Minnesota, and that's where I live. And so I basically, yeah, I studied philosophy up until I graduated in 2022. And since then, I play in a band, so I basically have been doing that for the last like 2.5 years or so. But I've been, yeah, just reading a lot of philosophy ever since. Because honestly, uh, it was naming a necessity that when I found out about the necessary a posteriori, I was like, what is going on? And then I just went down a huge rabbit hole. And this book was really helpful in making me sort of like understand what exactly it was about the problem that was bugging me. But yeah, so I'm not in school right now, but I'm just kind of living
Do you
life.
think you might go back and pursue a PhD?
I may. I've talked with some people about it, and but I think that what I wanted to do with this series is just kind of dip my toes in, get active again in sort of just like the community and just talk. But also just was spending so much time. Like I was literally on tour in like DIY venues, like reading books, and I was just like, I need to talk with some people about this before I lose my mind.
Mhm.
So, it's really great to finally be able to talk to some people about it. But yeah, so I'm considering it. Obviously, the job market is not amazing. So, I've been considering various options, but I'm at
People
a
do get jobs, you know.
people do get
We've done very well placing our students in the last 10 years.
well, really? Okay, got it. Well, that's good. I was gonna ask, yeah, I mean USC, how is it over there at USC?
Fantastic. We were reviewed. We didn't realize we were being reviewed, and it was in the early 2020s. Turns out we did better placing our PhD students than any department in the English speaking world.
No way! Wow, that is incredible. That is incredible. Is there an emphasis there specifically? Is it a lot of philosophy of language people, or is it pretty broad?
It's pretty broad.
That's
Um,
awesome.
no, I was surprised when it came out that we worked very hard at it, and we have good people, and people work hard,
Yeah,
and
that's awesome.
it's really doable.
That's really great. I mean, I hadn't honestly really, it wasn't super on my radar until I found out that you were there. So I was like,
If you were to specialize in philosophy, do you have an idea what you would specialize in?
you know, I go all over about it. I think that my initial sort of thought is definitely, I mean, it's got to be philosophy of language. But I mean, really, it's the problem of representation and how we represent things, and basically just like truth. And I mean, that's why this the idea that basically an act type theory of meaning and of representation, that was the first thing that really clicked for me. Of like, okay, this I think that this is basically just in general something that I'd want to to develop. And I personally am sort of like a little bit, I have a little bit of an old school like philosophy of language is kind of a first philosophy thing going on for
Mhm.
me. And so I know that's not your view at all. But so I was, very happy to see that there was a lot of stuff that we did agree on. But, you know, but I think that like yeah, I have a lot of ideas about it, and I've been writing a lot about it, but at the same time it seems like the general sort of focus of it is of like what is the one thing that I'm really interested in some sense. That's what I want these videos to try and help tell me. It's just like what is the one thing, but it definitely has to do with basically it's the question of the proposition. That's what I'm interested in the most for sure. So
Well, think about coming to USC. I'm not planning to retire,
oh
and
well, great, good to hear.
we've got some. John Hawthorne is here, who's really a terrific.
Wow, oh my
There.
gosh, I had no idea. Wow.
And there's a young guy who's just a phenomenon, Andrew Bacon, just
Never heard.
terrific. And I'm just mentioning a few. There are people who do this. We've got a linguist. We hired a straight up linguist in our
Wow,
department,
that's awesome.
Alexis Wellwood. She'll probably be either chair or co-chair next year.
Okay.
And so she she is important. We have a guy who had been in the linguistics department who's decided he'd be more at home in philosophy. So he's 50-50, but we're his home department.
Wow.
And there's plenty of work of various kinds. It's not all like mine. It's other people do different aspects.
Oh, I'm sorry. It just broke up there. Oh, let's see.
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah, you did too.
oh, okay, got it. I think you're back now. I think you're back now. But well, I mean, let me put it this way: you may see an application
Okay,
come
so
across
you'll
your
send
desk.
me this.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, and I'll send you this and all.
Okay,
Yeah.
get it in by
What do you
get
say?
it in by whatever it is, December 15th.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Perfect. I will. All right. Well, thank you so much again.
Okay,
Awesome.
it was
See ya.
enjoyable. Bye. Good luck.
Thanks.